Okay, here it goes. Well, hello everyone. Welcome to another edition of One Plus One, your place for inconvenient truth telling and myth busting. It's our All Indigenous Affairs episode, our All Things Native Lives Matter episode, and we are rejoined by past guest Professor Anton Treuer of the Ojibwe people of Minnesota, and he works at Bemidji State University, and he's the author of many books and yes, he's the author of many books, such as Everything You Want to Know About Indians But Were Afraid to Ask, The Cultural Toolbox, Traditional Ojibwe Living in the Modern World, The Language Warriors Manifesto, How to Keep Our Language Alive No Matter the Odds, Atlas of Indian Nations, The People of Minnesota, Ojibwe, and The People of Minnesota, Ojibwe and Minnesota, The Indian Wars, Battles, Bloodshed, and the Fight for Freedom on the American Frontier, Warrior Nation, A History of the Red Lake Ojibwe, The Assassination of Hole in the Day, and I believe this is a collection of Native American voices which Professor Treuer edited called Living Our Language, Ojibwe Tales and Oral Histories, a bilingual anthology. He is my guest for the hour on North America and the world's most urgent issue, human rights issue, which is the most criminally overlooked and underreported issue, which is the fight for Indigenous rights, and which should be the high focus of all anti-colonial people power and social and racial justice movements and eco-socialist movements. And yes, so let's get into it. So first of all, Professor, sorry for that mumbled introduction, but first of all, thank you for coming back on the program.
Thanks for having me.
It's like I said, it's a real honor to have you on. And the first thing I wanted to talk to you about, Professor, because you know there's so much I wanted to talk to you about, but let's first talk about this one, which is of course the media representation of Indigenous people. And I wanted your reaction on the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences, the Oscars apologizing to Sacheen Littlefeather for the grotesque racism and heckling and booing she received when Marlon Brando declined his Oscar for Best Actor in a Leading Role for The Godfather, which was his comeback movie. And Brando, if one can listen through the hissing and booing, said, you know, she of course was speaking on his behalf, said that he was declining the award as a protest to Hollywood's denigration of Indigenous Americans, most notably in Western films, you know, like John Ford's The Searchers, starring John Wayne. Brando also did it to show solidarity to the standoff at Wounded Knee, which the American Indian movement, led by Russell Banks and led by Dennis Banks and Russell Means, were involved in. And I wanted your reaction on this. And do you think this apology? Do you think this is a one-off apology from Hollywood, or are we going to be seeing more apologies, and with that, a golden age of Native Americans and other Indigenous writers and their collaborators doing indie work as well as big pictures, where we get unapologetically outspoken and, of course, at times truly horrific on-screen depictions of the different levels of apartheid Indigenous people have suffered, as well as the resistance. And as well as stories of incredible odds of, you know, Indigenous people bettering themselves despite, the avalanche of racism that they have to overcome. So I wanted your reaction on that.
I would say, in a nutshell, Hollywood is evolving, but not yet fully evolved.
Okay, so, interesting.
You know, as has happened with pretty much every marginalized racial group, there's been a process of, misrepresenting, denigrating, and so forth that has gone on with the first forays into film. And then, there's kind of a migration to having acute marginalized racial person for a sidekick, or for a backdrop or window dressing for basically a white story.
Yeah.
And it's been more recent that there has been an evolution where, you know, I think Hollywood was surprised, for example, even very recently when Black Panther did so well at the movies without having a centered white character, you know? And I think Hollywood realizes, first of all, just with the economics, that there's a market for movies that aren't only about white people.
Yeah.
So that's new information for them, but it is being seen that way. And Hollywood still is, you know, with the entrenched elites, financiers, directors, a predominantly white space. And, you know, it's shifting and changing, but it still has a long ways to go. And, you know, I would say like Hollywood's treatment of Black Americans has been evolving a little bit ahead of its treatment of Indigenous people, in the sense that you can actually have...
Exactly. I completely agree with you. Completely agree with you.
Right. So,
and queer people for that matter. And
right.
Yeah, could do better on Latinx people, but yeah, exactly.
As an example, you can have Black guys who are good guys or bad guys, or good guys who are, you know, complex, and bad guys who are turning good, and
yeah, anti-heroes.
Whatever, you know. It's, yes, Denzel Washington plays most of the parts, but you know, it's shifting, right? With the Native stuff, though, it's much more recent. Like, you are more likely to see, and Americans see, more movies about aliens than Native Americans, right? And so we are left to our imaginings, and the information that we have about Natives is, you know, 85% of academic standards that have anything to do with anything Indigenous is only about stuff from before 1900. And so we are something that happened in the past, or something with a tragic ending. And the idea that it's different is just starting to emerge for a lot of people in Hollywood. That said, there have been recent shows, Reservation Dogs on FX.
By the way, would you recommend that show to?
I sure would. Yeah, I think it's great. And you got Native screenwriters, you know, storytellers, actors. It's authentic and it's fun, you know, and it also sometimes says quite poignant things. On the lighter side, Rutherford Falls, which went for a couple of seasons, you know, on Peacock. You know, and so these are new emerging efforts, and there are lots of hungry Native directors, wannabe film producers, you know, actors, and so forth. And I think they will be seen more and more, and it will continue to evolve. There's a ways to go, and it's kind of like, you know, in so many different genres, you know, the fact that you get one person who breaks through a barrier, the fact that we're celebrating someone who broke through a barrier is just evidence that that barrier is still very much there, you know. When it's like, yawn, oh, another Native movie, then you know we've actually gotten somewhere, you know. Right? So we're starting, we're emerging, and you know, I do think, you know, that the movie industry, but also the publishing industry, you know, and so many other different entertainment and information sources are trying to figure out how not to be quite so white, you know, and it's not always easy for them. Although it seems like it should have been done ages ago, you know, but they're finding their way, and it's in process.
So I would say you definitely welcome the Academy apologizing for the racist treatment Sacheen Littlefeather received when And again, it was Marlon Brando that declined the Oscar. She was just there to, basically convey the message. And so you definitely welcome the apology, however late it was, and just hoping that there will be more goodness to come from it, as opposed to just a one-off apology, right?
Yeah, the apology was welcome and appropriate. It's good they did that. There are many other things to apologize for.
So
and I
just the
do
searchers
that
in every
a
single
remedy, an effort to like own historical injustice and mistreatment is healthy and necessary and can provide healing, but also changing how we're doing business right now and the messages that we provide to people through these very powerful venues is an even bigger part of restorative justice. And so I'm seeing some action there, and I applaud that and encourage much more.
One can only hope. One can only hope. But we need definitely a robust people power movement to do that, and lots of solidarity, work, in doing that, so that we don't see more ridiculous Western films or more, the kind of casual racism that gets, sort of dropped in certain movies and TV shows. I remember watching Malcolm in the Middle one time. The family goes to in Native American casino or Indian casino, and oh my gosh, I can't believe they actually say, yeah, they actually said this in the in the TV show. One of the characters goes, why do Indians have so many casinos, or why do they only continue casinos? Geez, Malcolm, you know what? I actually don't know. So there's that kind of casual racism that gets dropped, and then there's the TV show Shameless, which I liked, the kind of early seasons until it kind of lost its way. But they had one episode where they had an indigenous person helping out with a scam, making them do the big the ceremony with the ceremony with the fires. I don't know why the name escapes me.
Wet lodge, yeah,
exactly, the wet lodge. And then it turns out that person wasn't really a Native American. He was actually a Mexican scamming, because Native Americans, they get so much free money from the government due to past grievances. So there's that kind of BS where if it was any other group, there would have been mass protests, online activism going on, and yet Hollywood can continue to denigrate Native Americans like that. And then, of course, there's the ridiculous episode of The Sopranos where Native Americans were protesting against Columbus Day, and of course the Italian American community, led by the mafia of all people, those wonderful representatives of of their people, are protesting and just saying racist upon racist stuff and just denigrating indigenous people. Like
right.
Your response to that, and
yeah, I mean, I saw all of The Sopranos, and I also saw all of Shameless, and I did make note of both of those scenes. In The Sopranos, it was really Tony Soprano, like actually getting an appointment at a casino with a native casino manager to try to raise a stink, and then finally realizing, that's not even who's protesting Columbus Day or whatever, and
Jesus
he just
Christ.
gives up on it. So
worst episode of Sopranos on top of that, and there's lots of stuff to get offended about The Sopranos, but I got a soft spot for the gangster flicks. But that episode, even when I would rewatch it, I just had to always skip that episode because it pissed me off so much.
Like I said, it's evolving but not evolved. You got Johnny Depp, a white man, playing natives like in Lone Ranger, or you get Dances with Wolves, and you got a white guy who's better at being native than the natives. They're critiques to apply to many of the things that have been done, and they're quite valid. But at the same time, some of the very newest stuff that's coming out, especially the stuff that is like not native inspired, but native led, I think is pointing us in new directions. So I encourage more of that.
Alrighty, and you do recommend reservation zones then?
Yes, yeah, it was a
Okay,
great consideration.
I'll have to find a way to, well, illegally watch it,
Uh,
and then,
it's
but
on FX, comes through Hulu.
and while on that subject, and actually, yeah, and while on that subject, you know, I wanted to ask you, this, there's a very tiny amount of, white folks of privilege speaking out against white supremacy at its most atrocious, which is the ongoing mistreatment of indigenous people and the brutal subjugation that your people still face. The only ones I can think of that come to mind were, I mentioned, Marlon Brando and Johnny Cash, and that's about it. Now, those are the only two people from the big cultures of white America and multicultural melting pot America, the film industry and folk and country music, who use their platforms to speak out on the Jim Crow apartheid and the unique evils inflicted on your people. What we would call Southern colonialism. Johnny Cash did an entire concept album, and I think it's one of his best albums, called Bitter Tears, Ballad of the American Indian. And although he was met with many country rock and folk stations not wanting to play the album, or only playing only minimally playing the Ballad of Ira Hayes, I wanted, so my question is, why do you think, unlike the Jim Crow of old and the new Jim Crow that Black Americans are subjected to, or queer liberation, women's liberation, the rights of illegal immigrants, mainly of Latin America, and Latinx pride and solidarity to, that broad umbrella of people. Then, of course, there's workers' rights, and then anti-war and anti-imperialism activity, and even Palestine justice movement. As difficult as it is to dedicate one's time to that, why do you think so few artists speak out on the plight of Native Americans, as well as the broad people power movement? Why do you think the U.S. left and the U.S. Has not, spoken out a lot on the plight of Native Americans? And when we come to people nowadays, the only actor or actress that comes to mind in Hollywood that's involved in Native Lives Matter struggles is Shailene Woodley, who was a lot at Standing Rock, and I commend her solidarity work. But why do you think so few in the music industry and in the film industry have not spoken out more on the plight of Native Americans? And
that's a good question. I think it's complex, and it depends on context for who you're talking to or about. But first of all, I've never met a person from any marginalized racial group who feels like they're getting enough airtime, enough microphone, or that their issues are being properly and sufficiently advanced and there's nothing else we need to do, right? So one of the things is that, the Black population in America is whatever, 12 to 15% of the population. The, Latinx population's higher than that. And so when somebody's making noise, those populations are better represented. That doesn't mean they're well represented, or certainly not in all of the places in ways that they should be.
Yeah.
But it's harder to avoid.
Yeah.
Paying some attention to Black and Latinx voices. People still find a way, and they're still trying to ignore those voices, but it's harder to totally avoid, especially if you're working for a bigger organization or institution, whether that's a public school, a government office, or whatever, even a business. If 15 or 20% of your business is, from a particular group, you're going to pay attention to that. That makes a difference. Native people are, less than 2% of the country's population. And where Native people live is concentrated in certain areas. So the Southeast, they moved a lot of the Native population to Oklahoma. And so while there are still Native Americans in places like Florida and so forth, it's less visible and easier to ignore for huge sections of the American population. The whole East Coast of the United States, which has some of our densest population concentrations, there are Native people there, but there are so many other people, and so many of the Native tribes that were there also relocated or were forced to move or what have you, that they are also not as
In other
visible.
words, they had to do an exodus. So say, indigenous population of New York, did many of them had to do an exodus? Many of them just had to move in order to find some sort of a better way of living, or to, yeah.
Well, the Delaware, one of the tribes from New York, endured numerous relocation efforts by the British, even before America existed, and the Americans. And there are still Delaware people in New York, but some have a reservation in Oklahoma, some have a reservation in Wisconsin, some are living in Canada. They're all over the place. And it's not like there's 50 million of them sitting in New York State where you would notice. You know what I mean? So
yeah,
as a result, it's easier for people to ignore and imagine. And everything in the training that Americans receive, a sugar-coated version of Chris Columbus in the first Thanksgiving, and then not much else on Native anything, makes it easier to psychologically put that in the back. Also, I think America just has a lot of growing up to do as a country, with how it wrestles with American exceptionalism. Greatest country on earth, greatest people on earth, greatest constitution on earth, right next to the Bible, all this kind of stuff. So much so that some Americans can't even tolerate conversation about anything that went wrong. And so, like, if we're talking about the Black narrative, folks in that camp will be like, yeah, sure, there was a little bit of slavery and stuff, but we got the Emancipation Proclamation, and how about Abraham Lincoln? He was so awesome. And yeah, there was some Jim Crow stuff, but we got Martin Luther King. So, and there's a Martin Luther King Boulevard in every major US city in the country. So we are star-spangled awesome, right? And so there's this way that the narrative gets cast to focus on America's exceptionalism and awesomeness, and it gives a sense of like psychological relief, and it props up that narrative. And there are only like two things we got right in the whole Black narrative, but that's what we teach and talk about.
And then
what
for
did we
indigenous, no, continue.
So the question I have then is, what did we get right in the Native American narrative? And the answer is usually some form of like crickets chirping because no one's got an answer. There's no way to prop up the narrative of American exceptionalism if you're going to talk about the Native experience.
So it's kind of like what Lenny Bruce once said: if white America told the truth for one day, its whole world would fall apart. That's kind of like why, because yeah, if you do talk about the plight of indigenous people, ongoing plight of indigenous people, in which because yes, you can get away with the Black narrative by saying, well, yes, guys, but Martin Luther King Jr. saved your day, and look, there's a Black middle class now, and we haven't got everything right with Black people, but yeah, but they have that kind of way to like spin it as if things are getting better, or they might, and I'm sure they probably do the same with Latinx people, probably would do the same thing with queer liberation people, but you can't do that with the indigenous people because America's not made any efforts to, I think, properly address the wrongs of the bloody past, right?
Yeah, I would say it's not that nothing has been done or that nobody, is thriving or anything like that. But yes, there is still an ongoing oppression dynamic that has not been remedied. And, the stuff we teach about natives is so erroneous. It's like scattered bands of roaming nomads in the wilderness. And we're all immigrants here. All things that say there was room for everyone else and it's okay that they came. But the reality is inescapable. Like, there were 100 million people in the Americas at the time of contact, 100 million. There were 75 to 80 million people in Europe at the same time. So all of the land was occupied. Everyone else's arrival, it wasn't like there was room for everyone. This land is your land, this land is my land, sing the song and celebrate. It required a taking. It was genocide. It was dispossession. And there's no way to look at the native narrative without acknowledging that on some level. So America does what it usually does and puts its head in the sand and declines to look at its own oppressions.
Anything that's why there has been so few people in music industry, and you think that's one of the reasons? That's one of the reasons why
it's complex people. It's humans, it's nothing. It would be nice if it were simple. It's just this one thing, but there are a lot of things. So some of it is just people just don't know. They don't even know enough to know what they don't know. It's ignorance. A second thing is it's willful ignorance. I don't want to look at that. Don't tell me about that. I don't want to hear that. This is the greatest country on earth. So that's a second thing, and people also, deal with a lot of shame, just talking about tough topics, and don't want to expose an ignorance or offend somebody. And so it's easier not to say anything. And especially if you know so little about it, it's easier just to shut up, and there have been people, Mark Ruffalo, Shailene Woodley, who've been doing stuff lately, which is awesome. And there have been cases in the past where people have used their voice. Johnny Cash, by the way, has Native American ancestry. And so in many ways, he was trying to tell his story.
Supposedly.
Yeah. So,
but yeah, it's very honorable that he did speak out. That he did speak out on the plight of Native Americans. I think continuing to do that well into his death, as well as as well as Marlon Brando, which is why I have such a special respect for for those two gentlemen.
Yeah. So but things are shifting and changing and evolving, just broadly in social justice movements. And, I think we're all talking to each other more and holding each other up a little bit better. That doesn't mean there aren't fractures and divisions and, all kinds of things that go sideways. That doesn't mean some people are not playing the oppression Olympics or pointing fingers at each other or declining to support anything unless it's their particular groups. All that stuff happens, but it's starting to shift. And, I don't know, in response to George Floyd's murder, there was a very multiracial response and protest here in Minnesota. That doesn't mean that all of that went right, but I do think that we are starting to mobilize resources and pay attention to one another's stories. And some of the issues that we all deal with, issues of maybe hypervisibility, racial profiling, or invisibility and marginalization, can be experienced by people from many different groups. And so it's easier to empathize with other people who are having that experience and say, oh, I get that. Okay, let's do something, and so there's movement, and sure, some of it might sound like window dressing, but it's first steps on a journey. Whether you're doing land acknowledgements for an organization or, whatever it happens to be, Sure, if that's all you did, that would just be window dressing. But if it's followed up with genuine action, it's just the first, timid step in a long journey.
Interesting response, and thank you for that response. And then I have to ask this question: what do you think it's going to take for those various honorable people power movements I mentioned and left wing media, to show more urgent solidarity and coverage to Native Americans? And I'm talking more than just saying free Leonard Peltier at some anti-police brutality rally or some online event in which the plight of Native Americans isn't going to be discussed, let alone mentioned in passing, compared to other marginalized groups. And hopefully it'll happen. And yeah, so what do you think it's going to take for the U.S. left to get to the level that the Canadian left or New Zealand left is at showing solidarity to Indigenous people, and the society at large is more conscious of the issues to the point where major corporate state media has to cover this? Political parties have to answer questions and put in their platforms how they're going to deal with the plight of Indigenous people.
Yeah, it's such an apples to oranges kind of comparison, just because the political dynamics. Like in New Zealand, the treaty whereby the whole country of New Zealand was created has strong sovereignty provisions. And so there's just more for the Maori population to use for leverage with their voice. And then, Auckland, New Zealand, has like a majority Indigenous population. So that's very uncommon in other parts of the world. So that gets people
exactly. If you want to compare settler colonialism to Australia, Canada, and the U.S. and the U.S. for that for that matter.
Yeah, and in all of the Americas, Argentina and Costa Rica and the United States have the lowest Indigenous populations, and the US lowest of all. Like,
yeah,
pretty effective with the genocide, but at the same time, Canada's very different. Shoot, the defense secretary of defense is a Sikh who wears a turban. Like, could you imagine the Secretary of State in the United States, being a Sikh who wears a turban? It's hard to imagine. Maybe someday we'll get there. But
we have Colin Powell, though.
We did, we did.
But yeah, that stupid joke.
Yeah, we got a Colin Powell and we got a Barack Obama, and neither one heralded the end of racism. It just exposed new levels of racism, like there's presidential racism. We didn't even know it existed, but it does. And we're still dealing with the aftershocks right now in our American political system.
Yeah.
Like, people were so upset. It's crazy. So yeah, I mean, I hesitate to make direct comparisons, although there are some things that are similar with the settler colonial experience. And I think just Canada coming out of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, a formal acknowledgement that the country engaged in genocide, and restorative justice efforts that are starting to emerge, more money devoted to Indigenous language and culture restoration, things like that, but they have just different, even demography. Like 80% of the Canadian population lives within 50 miles of the US border. When you get north of there, it's pretty Indigenous space. And, you do have more Indigenous representation in government, and they've been developing a vocabulary and some shared understandings about some of these issues. Doesn't mean that there aren't jerks in the Canadian government. I mean, there are, no doubt. There are lots of Canadian communities that still have boil water advisories because they are neglected, in ways that should be completely unacceptable. It's not like it's better. It's just different. And, there are other things that are, distinct about the American experience. just the nature of sovereignty being codified in American law and acknowledged by the Supreme Court. I mean, that's why tribes can build casinos when gaming's illegal elsewhere in a particular state, So there are some things that are distinct and perhaps favorable to tribes in the US context, even though there's some things that are really making it much more difficult here too at the same time.
But what do you think it's going to? But then, what do you think it's going to take for the U.S. left and its media, and just in general, like even putting aside the political spectrum, which I'm part of, which is the left, hence why I mentioned the left, but just society at large. What do you think it's going to take for white America, multicultural, racial America to address to address the plight of Native Americans, and we see the dawn of of a kind of equivalent to what the civil rights movement and what Latinx Chicano movement was.
It's going to take time and effort. So I don't know, a lot of people on the left have read Paulo Freire's Pedagogy of the Oppressed and Education for Critical Consciousness. And I do think that the core concepts there have application in this Native context as well. Specifically, I think Freire would say, and these are my layman's terms for boiling down his sometimes academic ways of talking,
Yeah, I've read about this, so yeah, I know exactly what you mean.
Get a thesaurus and a bottle of aspirin, but you'll be greatly enlightened when you're done. But I think he would say there's never been a case of an oppressed group being liberated by their oppressors. It's never happened. There has been liberation from oppression only when the oppressed raise their voice and compel the engagement of the oppressors with the oppressed. And Freire would say that engagement in, a dialectic, a dialogue between oppressor and oppressed that transforms both. In Karl Marx, in like actual Marxism, it's through conflict, that rather than a dialogue, that you compel the change in perspective and you restructure society. So there's a difference in the two, but the concepts have application, and it applies to so many things. Like, shoot, if a husband and wife are, see something differently, they will not resolve their differences until one of them raises the issue and they either have a discussion about it or a fight about it and arrive at a new understanding. It's just kind of common sense. So natives will continue to be ignored until we, as natives, force the conversation. And that will shift consciousness. And then people will have it on the radar screen, as well as tools and partners to act with for the best causes, So part of it is something that we have to do. And Freire would say that's an unfair burden that falls upon the oppressed to raise their voice all the time instead of, the oppressor doing it. But I've come to realize, with many of the things that I work on, like Indigenous language revitalization, well, yes, Uncle Sam should come walking out of the bush with my language on a silver platter and say, sorry about the last 500 years and here you go. But if I wait for that, what are my chances? Not too good. So even though they should, I must shoulder the burden and do the work, And it is the same with the social justice stuff. Like, yes, they should, change all the vocabulary, the maps, the actions of the US government. They should write all kinds of policies and cast out all kinds of laws and pass a bunch of new ones. And, they should, but they won't unless we raise our voices, mobilize resources, get in conversation with one another. And something that makes it more possible is when other people who just care about anything are open to caring not just about the things that they think are affecting them the most, but things that are affecting other human beings. And if we care about that, and we are curious about other people's perspectives, experiences, sufferings, then that will make it easier for us to be opened by someone else's dialogue. And so I have found myself stumbling, bumbling, blundering along in life many times, but have tried to stay open. And when I've been corrected, or when someone has said, dude, no, not like that. And maybe we've had an argument with one of my college friends about whatever, I have tried to stay open and have shifted and changed and transformed through those experiences rather than stiffened, brittle, and unyielding to them. And I think that has helped me grow and become stronger and a better advocate, for things beyond my, highest depth of knowledge. And I think across social justice movements, if Black people and brown people are fighting each other, for example, whether they're fighting each other for the microphone, attention, resources in a school district, or whatever, like white supremacy wins. When we see one another and hold one another up, learn from one another and validate one another, then nothing can stop us. So that's what we got to do. And it's a lot easier to say like that than it is to actually get it to happen. It can be frustrating. And yes, we're all starving, for oxygen and action and all these different things. But I do see shift and change, and I do have cause for hope, even though I see how much is messed up.
Well, actually, before I get to this other question, I wanted to ask you about the future of the United States. And yes, we still have some time. You were talking about you were just mentioning how Black people and Latinx people they should not be fighting one another for scarce resources or even for the microphone. They actually should be working together, because that if they really wanted to beat white supremacy. You mentioned something else about how you have some people who engage in the oppression Olympics. I liked how you mentioned that. So do not want to ask this question, but I feel but then I feel the need to ask it because of the stuff that you just mentioned. Is do your response to some Black people, some Black leftists who, oh, Professor, you still there? Okay, perfect. Yeah. So your response to some Black leftists and others who say that they don't want to show solidarity to Indigenous people because some leaderships of certain tribes engaged in slavery, and then there are some from those same tribes who don't want to acknowledge, the biracial, Black natives that from as worthy of getting some kind of reparations and whatnot. So I wanted your response on that, and I just want to say that I personally think. Personally, I don't give a shit about that stuff in the past. I understand if there are some descendants of certain tribes, and those grievances do need to be dealt with. But I just find Black people, we have 99 problems, and Native Americans aren't one of them. They're not in the top 5. They're not even in the top 10. Not even in the top 20 of reasons why of reasons why we have so much, problems. A lot of that, you know, most of that, all of that has to deal with, white supremacy. And so I personally, don't care about some indigenous people in the past who may have engaged in slavery and stuff like that. But anywho, that's just my opinion. Yeah. When I hear black leftists speak like that, black nationalists speak like that, but yeah, your response to that.
Yeah. Well, I care. I think, first of all of us in a place like America have been socialized to racism. And as a result, anti-Black and anti-Indigenous thinking permeates people from all groups, including Black and Indigenous. And I don't think anyone should be held free from accountability for their own thinking, their own actions, or historical injustices from which they may have received a benefit. So, but again, that applies to all groups, because anti-Black thinking can show up in all groups, including Black.
Exactly.
Right? So, because a police officer is Black doesn't mean he isn't going to carry out his duties without racial prejudice, right? So we need to hold each other accountable, and we do need visibility to those things. Native people, shoot, some of our tribes are busy fighting each other for a long time. And I think we need to own that history too, and explore what meaningful reparations could look like. For example, I live in northern Minnesota. My tribe, the Ojibwe, fought with our neighboring tribe, the Dakota. I actually have Ojibwe and Dakota blood in my veins. Mm-hmm. And I feel like, because the Ojibwe deprived the Dakota of territory prior to the existence of the United States of America.
Okay.
That is still a historical injustice. And we should still explore what, some sort of healing reparation could look like. Maybe that means we open up our tribal hunting season to members from the Dakota nations. Mm-hmm. And we shouldn't just say that happened a long time ago, it doesn't matter. It matters. If it matters to someone, it matters. With regard to tribes, and there are a couple that engaged in chattel slavery. The Cherokee did, the Creek, and so forth. And like when the Cherokee were moved to Oklahoma on the Trail of Tears, their Black slaves went with. That's not okay. Now, the Cherokee Nation, just in 2017, their Supreme Court ruled that the descendants of the Cherokee freedmen would be eligible for tribal citizenship. And that was a ruling of their Supreme Court. Mm-hmm. And people had different views about it. Some said, well, this is a Native nation. It should just be open for Native people. It's not about being mean to the Cherokee freedmen. That was one argument. And others said, they walked with us, they bled with us. It's only fair and right and just. And so there was a big argument about it. But the Supreme Court for the tribe made that decision. And I think that one's been put to bed now, even though some people might grumble a little about it. But those are things that each group has to explore, and I do think they should explore those and try to make remedy for historical injustices. Now, if there's someone else who says, I'm not going to even talk to Native people or uphold their issues because of this historical injustice, I think that's immature and going to work to the advantage of white supremacy.
Exactly.
So I guess I would caution that while it's good to argue for accountability, that we can't afford to write off a whole group over historical injustice. If we did that, we wouldn't even talk to white people about racial justice. We'd say that's none of your business. But we need white people to be engaged in these topics. And it's not just because all of our grandkids are going to be marrying each other and making babies. We need, as human beings, to hold one another up. And instead of fighting over who gets to be the oppressor and who has to be the oppressed, work together to fight oppression. And so that means engagement from all people. And if someone is disengaging, it's a mistake.
Completely agree with everything you just said. Spot on. And I was speaking to we're almost out of time, but don't worry, I got three more questions. Three quick questions left, and then you can be very brief about it. I was speaking to Damien Gagnon, a member of a First Nation in Canada. Asking him when will the U.S. gets the level Canada is at, where there's urgent solidarity given to Indigenous people, and his response was quite a bleak one when I kind of asked the question I asked you, and he said he was talking to Native American friends of his from California, the state I spent my early childhood, and he said the following. He said that the U.S. is so polarized that there will be a civil war, the U.S. will dissolve itself, and I think given Roe v. Wade being overturned, I think we might see a lot of blue states like California, New York, and Massachusetts flirting with the idea of seceding from the United States. But he said that given the intense polarization that's going on between MAGA people and Biden's cult followers, that the first people who are going to experience the worst of it and the brunt of it are Native Americans. And so I wanted, what's your response to that? Do you think that the U.S. will disintegrate, or and yeah, your response?
Yeah, I don't think so. I used to think there'd be like 1% chance, and I'm thinking it's like 20% chance that we get a civil war. You know what I mean? Like, that's a higher chance.
Yeah.
There are some remarkable parallels, to like what was going on in Weimar Germany, for example, before the Nazi Holocaust, strong, well-established democracy, but there's some things that are so different and distinct. And it doesn't feel like it when you're in the middle of it. But there is often this like kind of pendulum that is pushing back and forth. And our most progressive surges are preceded by a lot of unrest, controversy that leaves people feeling there's an existential threat.
Mm-hmm.
And that happened, when we actually did have a civil war, and then got this Reformation, and there was a surge. Of course, you got to push back, and you got Jim Crow, and then you got a surge. And when we were in the middle of things like the Civil Rights Movement and the Vietnam War, like a lot of people thought America's going to die.
Yeah.
And not only did America make it through that, but we had, a somewhat more progressive surge for a while, especially during the Carter administration and things like that. And the pendulum keeps swinging back and forth. So yes, I mean, I was pretty disturbed to see the, takeover of the Capitol, and to see an effort to mobilize kind of on a militia level in opposition to things like the FBI or our well-established institutions, and to see presidential candidates who will not validate the results of a presidential election, things like that, and see people mobilizing resources to stop that. But I think it's mainly the realization that the power wielded by the right is going to be fleeting.
Yeah.
And if you look at the demography, like look at the demography for Germany. More people die every year than are born. More white people in Germany die than are born every year. And it's the same with Austria. It's the same with France. And the populations of those countries grow every year only because of immigration. And so today, 30% of the German citizenry is foreign born. 30%. And, 15% of France is Black. The data says these will be diverse places. Some people won't be happy. Some people will fight it, but it's pretty hard to engineer sustainable apartheid. They did engineer apartheid in South Africa and kept it going for quite a while, but it's not likely that it will be sustainable, and it also is not likely that there will be a sustainable genocide. The interventions and revolt would be just overpowering. That doesn't mean that people wouldn't be tempted to try, or some people wouldn't want such things to happen. But the demography for the United States says that the majority of the K-12 students in America are students of color. That's who's here. And that will not be overwhelmed by the Trump era. They're not going to start killing kindergartners. Yeah. They may try to engineer a new Jim Crow where it's harder for people of color to vote and succeed in sustaining their run a little longer. They may, keep a conservative bent to the Supreme Court for quite a while. It's jacked that bad, but they're not going to sustain this in perpetuity. And it's like I'm with King, when he says the arc of history is long, but it bends toward justice. It's never going to happen fast enough. It's not going to happen without casualties. There are all kinds of oppressions that shave years off of your life and mine that should not be there. Mm-hmm. There's the longevity tax, but the demography says we will be blacker and browner. The demography trend says we will be ever more progressive and even increasingly secular. And I don't think that a political pushback era is going to disintegrate the nation or stop the tide.
So it sounds like the advice you would give to many, to all Native Americans in the U.S., those in the mainland, those from Hawaii, those from Alaska, and even Aboriginal people from Australia, keep calm and carry on, or yes, be angry but continue to fight, and that there won't be a period where nations of people just are fed up and just decide we're just going to do a mass exodus over to Canada or a mass exodus over to New Zealand.
Yeah. Well,
where race relations are slightly.
I would not say keep calm and carry on. I would say there are thousands of intolerable oppressions, and we should make thoughtful, careful choices about which ones we will fight, and we will fight them. And rather than a revolution, because revolutions don't always solve things either. If you have like overthrow the government kind of revolution, like they killed all of the monarchs in most of the European countries, like chopped off, Marie Antoinette and Louis XVI's heads in a guillotine, and you still got a new system with its own oppressions.
Yeah. Uh-oh.
And you know, you same thing with Russia.
Yeah.
You know, you had a revolution, and then you had to build a new society.
Yeah.
Are we freezing up, Youri?
Yes, we see. Yeah, and that's internet problems. That's internet problems of me because of because there's a big storm coming. But I can
You're
hear you
coming
right
through a
now
bit
again.
better now.
Yeah. Yeah, so you were
Yeah.
saying, yeah, so you were saying, you know, yeah, yeah. Continue on with what you were saying about the Russian Revolution because that was a very important point.
Yeah, so when you get the Russian Revolution, the idea of communism is to take from each according to their ability and give to each according to their need. They kill all the czars and their family, and they have to build a new society. But they use the same cultural building blocks. And so you end up with a society that's still highly stratified and full of oppressions. So even if you had a revolution in America, after killing a bunch of people and building something new, you'd still have oppressions. That doesn't mean that, you know, we don't need to change a whole bunch of things, because we do. And that doesn't mean that we should take a slow walk through timid reforms.
Yeah.
We need some major changes. So I just think we need to be thoughtful and considered, and we need to mobilize resources, and we need to work really hard. These views are underrepresented in our government. And so, in addition to the value of things like protest, I'd like to take a lot of people from the protest community and have them run for school board and city council and Congress and work things on that side too.
Yeah.
And yes, those systems can be frustrating. It can be death by bureaucracy. It can be where great ideas go to die. I see all of those things. I don't have blind faith in our institutions. We just need to fight on all fronts. And when I say make careful, thoughtful, and considered decisions, what's going to give the greatest value to the greater good we're trying to engineer? A form of civil disobedience that actually breaks the law to the point where you go to jail and then you're a felon and you can't get a decent job and can't take care of your kids and suffer for life. Maybe there's something worth protesting at that level for. Or are you going to do more good, you know, running for school board or city council and advocating every single step of the way for all of the things you believe so strongly in? What's going to give you the biggest lever to engineer societal change? And it is often our divisions that hold us back and provide us the greatest limitations.
As my hero Ralph Nader, the best president the U.S. Never had 3 times over. Breaking through power, it's easier than we think. Now, Professor, just before I let you go, we usually end the program nowadays with a questionnaire done by Marcel Proust, later perfected by Bernard Pivot, and then done by James Lipton of the late great James Lipton of Inside the Actors Studio. It's your turn to do this, and I promise you it'll be quick. So here it goes. So, Professor, what is your favorite word?
My favorite words?
Favorite word, just one word.
Just one word. Okay. I like the Ojibwe word anikobijigun. It's the same word we use for my great-grandchild and my great-grandparent. And that line spans 7 generations. So we should always think 7 generations ahead with all the decisions we're making.
Say that one again.
Anikobijigun.
What does that mean, actually?
Yeah, it literally means my line.
Nice. And what's your least favorite word then?
My least favorite word. Huh. Maybe hate.
Okay. And what turns you on spiritually, emotionally, or creatively?
I guess seeing other human beings operate on our stated values.
Okay. And then what turns you off?
Injustice.
And what sound or noise do you love?
What noise do I love?
Yeah, what sound or noise do you love?
Oh, what sound or noise do I love? Well, I love the sound of the birds out my window every day.
And then what sound or noise do you dislike?
I guess I would just say the voices of hatred.
Yeah. That's a good one. What, and then what's your favorite curse words?
My
And yes,
favorite curse
and yes, and yes, you can curse on this program.
word. I'm not sure if I've got a favorite one. I probably use them all without discrimination.
Okay, so no preference then.
Yeah.
Okay, no problem. And then, what profession, if you weren't doing what you do, would just being a fantastic educator and journal editor, what profession other than yours would you like to attempt?
Oh, I think I would have been a very happy carpenter. I like building things.
Okay, and then what profession would you absolutely not want to do under any circumstances?
Data entry.
Data entry. Okay, and then the final one before I let and then the final one. If heaven exists, what would you like to hear God say when you arrive at the pearly gates, or whatever is the afterlife of that the Ojibwe people believe in? What would you like to hear your creator or say?
Huh. I don't know. We've been waiting for you.
All righty. Well, we were joined on this edition of 1+1, our all Native Lives Matter episode, Indigenous Affairs episode, with Professor Anton Treuer of Bemidji State University, right?
Yep.
Of Bemidji State University in Minnesota. Professor, thank you so much for taking the time to come by. I look forward to having you back on again. This was a great conversation. I certainly felt much more optimistic about the state of affairs, having this conversation before. And yeah, and all I can say is keep doing the great work you do. And I hope that I hope not many people. I hope everybody hears your message and a better tomorrow comes today.
All right. Thanks so much.